Hello, this is episode 76 of the podcast called Blood and Rain. I'm your host, Arthur Dane. To Hooks, the city was a cancer, its corruption seeping into every crevice. Its presence felt like a malignant tumor devouring everything in its path. Here, no good men lay their heads. In this place, there was no refuge. Restaurants served as fronts that housed sex and slot machines. Neighborhoods held brothels hidden between residential faces, and churches laundered money in offering plates. In Phoenix City, there was no struggle between good and evil, no fight between criminals and the law. The crime was the law. It didn't matter what you called it, the syndicate, the Dixie Mafia. The name of evil matters not. It answers to whispers and shouts, and it belongs to tongues long gone and those yet to live. Evil owned the mayor, police chief, sheriff, and hospital. The city was theirs, and everyone knew it. This is the wickedest city in America, and it wore that title with pride. Now is a piece by today's guest, first guest of 2024, a Substack writer from the American South, typically specializing in noir by the name of John Slaughter. Thanks so much for being here, John.
Oh, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, you and I have sort of rubbed shoulders, like adjacent to people like Paul Fahrenheit and Jay Burden, and Jay Burden. He'll have a guest sometime. He'll message me and be like, "Hey, I met this guy. You should talk to him." I'm like, "All right, cool, yeah, check, let's do it." And he's like, "I'm gonna introduce you to John Slaughter. He writes noir." I'm like, "Cool, yeah, big noir fan." Um, and I linked up with you, and I read the first two chapters of Crimson Veil. That piece, by the way, to the listeners, that was a section of descriptive from the first chapter of this ongoing Southern Noir book called Crimson Veil. That is on John Slaughter's Substack, titled "The Southern Repository." It's a fantastic read. It's out there for free. He's doing a similar thing. Actually, he's doing the same thing that I'm doing in releasing multiple chapters of a book on Substack, much like the Foundation, much like the Foundation series was originally released on a science fiction, um, onto a science fiction magazine over the course of a decade. So yeah, definitely give that a read. So for the listener, John, you could just sort of give a crash course on where you come from, what you do, and why you do it.
Yeah, I wound up swimming in these circles online just over time, consuming a lot of the dissident right spheres, commentaries and media and things like that. And I kind of wanted to get involved. I've always been into writing, so I just started. First, I started writing some small pieces on my Substack called American Samurai, where I would just kind of give quick little I guess, vignettes about the life of sort of interesting people in American military history or just like the frontier. And then I decided to, take that farther and start writing, putting my fiction out there and everything. So I guess that's pretty much how I got into it, man. I just kind of fell into it, and people, specifically Jay Burden, liked my stuff, and then it's kind of slowly taken off from there.
Yeah, and honestly, rightfully so. Um, it was a great, great couple of chapters, and I actually looked at the amount of likes, and I was like, I was surprised it's this few. So I'm hoping I come from the Instagram writing sphere, which is, it's the outskirts of the dissident, right? Most people don't know we're there. I think the only person who kind of gained any kind of attention for a hot second was this political writer by the name of Totally on Anacreon, who's been on the show twice. But he was a guest on Alex Kashuta's podcast sometime in 2022. Um, but yeah, the creative writing side of things is definitely, I think, maybe a bit friendlier on Instagram. So I think everyone listening, in fact, there's an anti-fragile athlete who is in active duty who just started writing on Substack who would really like your stuff. And I think you both like each other's stuff, although he's only has the one piece out right now by the name of Cooper Miller. So shout out to you, Cooper. Um, yeah, so you're writing noir. What exactly first caught your interest in noir? Was it something literary? Was it something through film and television? Was it a convergence of both? Like, how'd that come about?
Well, it actually started when I was a kid. I don't remember where I was, but I remember watching the Maltese Falcon on
Mm,
television, and I found that really interesting. And then shortly after that, I don't know if you remember the Dick Tracy comics, which is kind of a cartoonish version of noir. But that became something I got into. So I kind of fell into it that way. And I guess there's a debate about whether if hard-boiled detective stories and noir are the same thing. I think they're closely enough related that I kind of lump them together. So I just found, like, as I got older, a lot of it started out with film stuff, like with Mel Gibson, which is like a neo noir, and even, it's unpopular opinion, but I actually enjoy the original 1982 release of Blade Runner with the voiceover where Harrison Ford is it feels much more like a noir in that. So that got me into it. Then I read some Raymond Chandler, and then most noir is set in places like Chicago, maybe New Orleans. You get New York and stuff like that, and I always kind of felt like the Southern Gothic literary tradition kind of has a lot of elements that remind me of noir, and I think that was a literary tradition that I sort of have always been in because of where I'm from, and they kind of just melded together. And I think that's why it always kind of spoke to me.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was actually going to ask you because that kind of seems like a pretty congruent fit there. Um, when I think of noir, I think of the big city. I think of places where I'm from and where I've lived. I've lived and I'm from Oakland, San Francisco, New York, and Chicago. So settings that are conducive to crime and to decay, and to people being able to hide in nooks and crannies of places. Um, but reading, the sort of high priest of Southern Gothic literature that is William Faulkner, one can find a similar essence of unnerving decay and having to accept certain given circumstances that are less than ideal, and being desensitized to the world around you to make any sort of semblance of sanity and the truth in the process. Um, in terms of noir, how did you sort of envision noir sort of like mingling with the South? Like, is it purely an essence thing, or do you see similar sort of character types across noir and Southern Gothic literature that could sort of strengthen each other?
Well, I think it's more in the essence of it, right? Because if you think in terms of, like, Southern Gothic always has this very, I guess you'd call it, melancholic, or this haunted nature about it. There's always something. You could almost say that when you're reading, whether it's Flannery O'Connor, or you're reading Faulkner, or many others, there is a sense that the South is haunted. It's haunted by all kinds of things, right? Like, it can never get out of its own shadow. And like you said, when you think noir, you think of these places like these big cities and all in decay. But a lot of people who aren't from the South don't realize exactly how bad things were down here for such a long time, right? So if you're from a place like maybe Virginia, some of the northern southern states, right, it's not as bad. But down in Alabama, Mississippi, parts of the Panhandle of Florida, parts of Tennessee, you get into these places that have always sort of been in a state of moderate decay since the Civil War ended. And the story that I'm writing is partly based around an actual city and an actual set of events where, like, it's not the Italian mafia, it's not the Irish mafia, but it's the Dixie mafia, and they run a crime syndicate that isn't just centered in Alabama, but it goes out to, their headquarters, I believe, was in Biloxi, Mississippi for a long time, but they ran stuff across the entire South. And I think that those same things those same themes of decay that you see, or that you highlight, and the darkness and the sort of the moral gray areas that exist within noir have always been there in the South. And I don't know that there's a lot of attempts to marry the two, but that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty safe fit, honestly. And it's not really something that I've seen a lot of people do. I'm trying to sort of reminisce on anything that I've like consumed, whether in a visual medium or the written word. One thing that does come to mind, have you ever watched Preacher or read the comic
Yes,
book Preacher?
I've seen
Yeah,
the show. Yeah.
yeah, I haven't read the comics. I've only seen the show. I mean, Dominic Cooper's a fantastic actor. Um, but some of the way that he sort of interacted with New Orleans, the people sort of not to get too many spoilers, but is trying to sell 1% of his soul in order to save somebody. It's a place like a seance. Um, and he's sort of in and out of like a good 200 different jazz clubs and whiskey bars, and it's some of the architecture maybe a little less Anglo and a little more reminiscent of something French, obviously, but an apples to apples comparison in some ways, like Havana, being sort of having its glory days and now sort of being run down and just a corpse dragged across the road. Um, but I'm kind of surprised that more people haven't attempted this. Um, because actually, I recently wrote a piece that I think you read called uh, "Bad Memories," and it's almost purely autobiographical, but it came like that sort of influence of essence of this article that I wrote, or this I called it an anthology of suffering, because that's really what it was. It was a series of different posts that I did on Instagram that were sort of tied together with one vague through line. Um, and it kind of started when I was listening to Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. They're a band from San Francisco, but they cross a bunch of different genres like punk, like Roadhouse, even gospel, and then folk. Um, and so it's like an amalgamation of sort of Americana music that's you'll find in the South and in the West. Um, and I remember there's a song literally called "Haunt" too on their latest album, and it had this same sort of slow, dreary, like hazy abandonment of the senses for something kind of sinister. Um, and while a lot of these, people talk about the crossroads and that sort of lore in blues music and music stemming from the South, and they did a song where they had lyrics pertaining to the crossroads, and I remember feeling this sort of like monkey on my back when I was listening to this, but I was interacting with the city that is San Francisco and sort of feeling that, and interacting with New York and sort of feeling that. And not to get too crazy right out of the gate here, but I think that haunting is correct. And something that George Bagby, when he was on Jay Burden's stream, he was talking about Mormonism. He said, "I want people to take Mormonism more seriously, not because I think it has merit; it doesn't. But I think Joseph Smith was actually listening to something, um, and it seems like there's something there within the South that maybe shows its face in cities too, or has a distant cousin. I know that's a lot to unpack there, but what do you think of all that?"
No, no, I think you're on to something there. I think I would say that the have you ever seen that I don't know, I guess it's sort of a meme idea that was around a few months ago about how the forests of Europe are not haunted like the forests of America.
Yeah, yeah, the
Right.
cryptids, they're different. Yeah,
Yeah, like the mythology of the American forest, or what exists, like the Wendigo and stuff like that, is very dark. It's ominous. There's a demonic element to it, um, and that's even something that I played with. That I'm probably going to try to incorporate with what I'm writing now. Is that the town or the city that I'm writing about, it when it was founded basically in blood. It was a hideout essentially for like outlaws and stuff like that, and they were constantly fighting with Creek Indians. And so the entire foundation of that place is built on essentially a bloodshed and constant murder between the two groups, right? And then of course you have the slavery aspect, right, which is a haunt, which haunts the South. But then the South is very, very religious as opposed to the rest of the country, which I think that religiousness still exists, and so people still believe in the spiritual realm, which I think allows that sort of haunted nature to come through, right? Like you said, like with the crossroads, you know, that whole idea, and I can't, was it, Robert, what is his name? I forgot his name now, but that idea that you meet the guy at the crossroads and you can sell your soul. It's this American Faustian idea. It's like a new version of Faust, I think. And I think that comes from the amount of bloodshed essentially that it took to conquer these places and to establish what we have now.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's definitely Faustianity on it. I wrote about that pretty significantly because I felt that in New York in spades. I think it just completely took over in New York. Um, I think that war is still being fought for Chicago's soul. Um, I mentioned when I was Jay Burden's show because I wrote a piece called "Dear Chicago" right after I'd gotten married and left Chicago. Um, that Thomas 777 is from Chicago. He's like, Chicago's an evil place, man. And I was just like, hey, and I didn't respond to that, but and he's from there, so I wasn't about to argue with him. But I'm like, I don't know if I believe that. There's a kernel of good in Chicago. There's actually a lot of good in Chicago. That's a battlefield that's present, to say the least. But I think the bigger battlefield in play is the United States. And funnily enough, on those cryptid memes, people were saying that, yeah, Europe used to have these evil cryptids, except the warriors killed them all off. So now that's why the forests are unnerving. Like just like how the UK has no predators anymore because they killed all the wolves and bears, somewhere around the 500s, basically. Um, and with the United States, it never really occurred to me that Faustian spirit could come from the amount of bloodshed uh, that was had to settle this country. That's never something that's really come to mind as much as a neglect to understand the land that European peoples had colonized. Like it's almost it's a law of unintended consequences that there may have been something weirder about that was forgotten from our European ancestors having settled Europe for so long. Um, when it comes to that sort of channel, I think you're right in terms of when people become religious, right? I know you're a Dixie Catholic, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Convert, yeah.
Yeah, we can get into that in a bit too as well. Um, when people become sort of lapse religious, right? But they're still kind of feeling something. When they lose the spiritual disciplines but maintain that open channel, it's so much easier to be deceived, right? They're sort
No,
of
I think that's why you see that in the South, because again, you think everybody kind of knows the Bible Belt and they understand that there is this residual spirituality that exists in the South, and also what I think separates the South from places like Chicago or New York or even other parts of the country in general is that the people in the South have all like most of these families down here, with the exception of some of the migration we're getting now as industry builds down here, these families have been here from the beginning. There wasn't a large influx of immigrants into the South at any point in time, after America was founded. So these families have been here for generations. So they're connected much more to the land than, say, families in Chicago, which I'm sure there's families in Chicago that have been here the whole time, but they're not as numerous as like where I'm from, where almost all of these people can have been here for over 100 years, if not more, in most cases.
hmm. So it's in like an unintended pagan worship of the land, so to speak. Or am I sort of mischaracterizing that?
Well, I wouldn't say pagan worship. I think it's just that when you're there, it's hard for people who don't have a deep rooted connection to a central place to understand that that place sort of occupies a space within your world that's different than somebody who's moved around a lot, right? Because you can drive down the road and and I can even do this now. I can drive down and say, well, that's my great granddad's whatever, right? Like there's a tree on my parents' property that is the tree they used to hang people from for the court, right? When they would do executions, in the town that they live in used to be a trading post before it became a town, right? That tree is still there. And I can tell you as a kid, when we would ride horses back there, the horses would always get spooked when you got near that area. Now, whatever that was is up for debate, but that was real and that was there, and we all knew about it. Or there's old dilapidated slave quarters on my parents' property that don't belong to my family at any point, but they've just been there. So you kind of have this. It's almost like, I guess I would say, maybe the ghost of the past speaks in the South more so than it does in other areas of the country.
Mm. Yeah, it's sort of there's a spirit. Places do have a spirit to them. Um, I'm really not very familiar with the South. It was once suggested to me that I should move to the Deep South because of my political leanings, having grown up in the most Marxist place on the planet. Um, but I got to a point where I got old enough that I wasn't as malleable, and it was clear to me that bloodlands are a different thing entirely. I'm sure when I go back to the Basque Country in May for the first time, I'll feel something. Right? Even just reading a book about the Basque people, I'm like, oh, so that's why I am the way that I am. Genetics are real. This is a very real thing, especially in our spheres. With these Spenglerians running about, right? Thomas Sowell adjacents. Um, but um, I got to a point though by nature and by environment that I'm there's something that if you sort of scrape off the modernization, the anti-culture that originates from California, you feel the original Western spirit of California. Um, when Paul Fahrenheit and I first met, he kind of pissed me off because he's like, "Yeah, California doesn't really have that much of a founding myth." I was like, "Excuse me, like the fabled coast, the Golden Gate, like the gateway to Asia. Like as soon as the United States became a country, like great, how are we going to get over there? Like this was the coveted place. This is the promised land." Um, that has commonality with pretty much everywhere in the Western United States. Um, it's in a rainier, dreary extent. See, you can feel that in Seattle. You can feel that Western spirit in Vegas, Southern California, Montana. Um, briefly been to Denver, and definitely in Texas as well. Right, so Texas is the nexus of the South and the West. But when I sort of peer at things, I speak to Southerners. Like it's a very fascinating, genteel, uh, and long enduring culture. Um, that I can admire it, but I know myself at this point. I am what I am. I kind of look at that and say, I don't think I could really do that. I don't think I could sort of live that life. I don't think I could sort of assimilate. Um, and I think that does also have to do with the spirit. It goes beyond just a certain set of customs and a certain set of norms. It is an accumulation of the spirit of stories that tie into the land for better or for worse. And I think what makes the South so fascinating is maybe the fact that it has endured. Is it's due to its greatest blow that was the Civil War. That's something that's sort of talked about a lot, but I'm curious from your perspective, being a noir writer, sort of interacting with the land around you, understanding it, feeling it. Um, how much is the South affected by that blow spiritually, and how long do you think that can last?
So it's interesting you bring that up because I actually wrote an article about 6 months ago for the Abbeville Institute about this exactly. Um, I've watched in my lifetime, the South has had a massive industrial boom in the last probably 20 years, and largely due to low taxes and things like that. Like we don't have unions down here, so a lot of companies are moving down here. As those companies move down here, they do hire people down here, but they also bring transplants, right? And I've watched the South change dramatically just in the last 20 years. And, in the piece that I wrote, I essentially said kind of what you're saying, which was, in my opinion, the South's culture was preserved and was because of the poverty and everything that was inflicted, all the damage inflicted by the Civil War sort of calcified the South. Nobody wanted to come down here. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of industry. So we were sort of left alone. And by being left alone, our culture was allowed to continue and thrive for generations. And just now, you're starting to see that change as transplants come. And one of the examples that I used in the piece is that there's this color that's very unique to the South called haint blue. Like, and haint is just a bastardized version of the word haunt, or like for ghost, right? And The origin of this color is that the islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, where the Gullah people are, that came over, with slaves and all, their culture sort of infused with Anglo culture. And as it happened, they also brought their own traditions, and they believed that this color blue, right, the specific color blue would keep ghosts away. And they used, I think, indigo to make this color, and they called it haint blue. And if you drive to the South today, you'll see porches, even in new houses that are built with that color on the porch. Now, people don't understand why it's painted that color if you ask most people, but that still endures as like a tradition because up until recently, the South was able to maintain that. So for that long, you have these small traditions, these specific ways of doing things that were preserved by the fact that we were left alone and we were beaten down and poor. And most people, after the Civil War, you have sharecropping and all that, and it's not until now you're starting to see wealth. But with that wealth, comes you basically, you don't want to sell your soul, right? You don't want to gain the world and sell your soul. And I feel like that's kind of what the South is doing now, essentially.
Do you think it's sort of why we've seen this increase in sort of like a watered down Southern culture? Like, one of my very close friends, he's my right hand man in Anti-Fragile Fitness. He writes in the moniker the Saxon Cross about Anglo culture, but he's from Louisiana and he did his high school years in Montana. And he came on my podcast and he said, "You're not really seeing Southern culture anymore. You're sort of kind of seeing like a pop Southern culture." Do you think that has to do with that, or do you think that comes from elsewhere?
No, I think that's part of it. It's if you that's a problem it's been going on for a long time. Even if you go into the '90s, there was a big boom in like country music. Then this really commercialized country music got exported because I think at this point, in my opinion, in this point, there's an argument to be made that that Southern culture is American culture, insofar as it's like the only true American culture left. Because, like I said, there were no large waves of immigrants to add to anything. So what you were getting was basically just this early infusion of African cultures and mostly Scotch Irish and
We're sort of losing you a little bit. Sorry, audio just turned back on. You said an infusion of African cultures and Scotch Irish cultures.
right, yeah. So you have this, obviously because of when the Civil War kicks off, there's about 9 million whites in the South, and there's I think 6 million slaves, right? So you can
Still lost you again.
oh, we're losing
Back.
audio.
Yes, you said last thing there was 9 million whites and 6 million slaves in the South.
Yeah, so you have obviously with those kind of numbers, you get a lot of cross pollination of culture. And I think, but that's all you got because you didn't have a constant revolving door of like using New York City as an example. You constantly have these Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, so on and so forth, coming in. That's always adding to that. So I think there's an element of like the Southern culture kind of became uh, something that you could just insert for American culture, but now that's the only thing that feels truly American, and so it's being exported and sold to everybody else in the country. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I use this example with Jay Burden, but when I was in Missoula, Montana, and I know the listeners seem to be like, "It's not the real like country Montana." Yes, I understand. It's a hick lib town. Thank you. Um, but there's before it was a hick lib town. It was just it was a town, probably something having to do with cattle ranching. I'm not sure if I'm being completely honest. I don't know the history of Missoula, Montana. It's a beautiful place. Um, and we went to a couple of very Rocky Mountain esque bars. You saw people who typically work with cattle, right? You also saw just college students there. And I said to someone there, I said, as long as America looks like this, I think we'll be okay, right? I don't want America America shouldn't completely look like New York. America shouldn't completely look like California, where I'm from. As long as it looks like this, I think we'll have some semblance of an identity. With this current dilution that's at play, um, do you think, because several of our friends from the South say that it's a culture that does force people to assimilate, right? People pick up the accent, people pick up the slow way of life, you know, just the way of life in general. Um, do you think that people can just go to the South and add to it like a tapestry, or do you think that dilution and destruction is inevitable?
I think you can add to that tapestry if it's a slow controlled drip, right? But I think it's sort of inevitable at this point because it's not that's not what's occurring. My wife is from North Carolina, and in the last 10 years, I've watched North Carolina dramatically change. And it's large part it's the giant cities, right? Like the one thing that is saving Alabama from that fate at the moment is the fact that we have four major cities. You know, we have Huntsville, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile, and together those four cities still don't equal half the population of the state. They're a little less than half, right?
Hmm.
So the rural part of the South, which is where the real heart of like Southern culture is, still has a lot of influence. But in places like in North Carolina, where you have the Research Triangle, you have places like Raleigh and all, the amount of money and the influx of outsiders is too fast for them to be assimilated, right? So that the people come in and they want to tear down, you know, your statues because they're offensive to those people. Whereas if you only have a few people coming in, they don't have the social capital essentially to make changes. They're forced to become a part of that landscape. And I think that the South wants, you know, it's too tempting to invite these companies down here and in places like that, and to get the tax revenue and the money. And so they're going to keep doing it, and in the end, we're probably going to be kind of gutted culturally. In the same way that, like when you were saying that, you know, Paul is saying that there's not this sort of founding myth of California. I agree that there is a founding myth, but I think that because California has always, at least like for the last 100 years, has just had massive waves of newcomers, that
Hmm.
all gets kind of buried under the new that comes in, and I think that's the fate of the South, unless something changes.
Yeah, you have to wonder, like, where does authenticity go? Does it then just go to like the Great Plains states? It's like Iowa have this boom for someone with money to come screw it over again. Like, when does this stop? It's. I mean, and I guess maybe that's like for lack of a better term, like this. I was gonna say soapbox, but the ballad of the South. It's like we have something that endures. You don't.
Hmm.
Um, but the sort of flip side of that is General Sherman's sort of letter to the South before the war started, saying like you know nothing of war. Like he's basically I don't have any quotes from it offhand, but the gist of it is saying like you guys have no idea what you're doing. Like you have no idea what you have done. We are mechanized to all get out, and we're about to set you ablaze. And he was right.
Huh.
In terms of logistical resources, you couldn't really draw any other kind of conclusion. Now, yes, they kind of got the South got the first string in terms of the American military minds: Lee, Buchanan, Stonewall Jackson, Longstreet, so on and so forth. But um, that's kind of the inevitable fate, and it's like you can sort of live this die on the hill beautiful death, right? Or you can sort of get with the times and then become a little bit less. And it seems to
But
be the inner war of America at present.
yeah, I mean the story of the Confederates could easily be a mirror of, you know, the last samurai, was it Shuriyama, right? Like
Yeah,
there's no winning there, right? Like the industrialized warfare in Japan, this new Japanese army is going to win. You know, you're holding on to something that is essentially it's futile in the end. Now it might be something worth dying for, but there is sort of a futility in trying to stand before, I guess. I mean, I don't want to call it the wheels of progress because I don't see it as progress, but for
yeah.
lack of a better term, that's what it is, right?
Mm.
You can't, the Luddites get crushed, right? So I think it's sort of that same idea. And like you said, the South, you can people will argue still today. Well, the South could have won, and maybe they could have won in the first year or two if they would have just took DC or something. But outside of that, the longer that war went on, like you said, the industrial capacity, the manpower, there was no winning. It was impossible.
No, no. Antietam was their shot, and they
Yeah.
fumbled that. That's it. And you can say that's a good thing, a sad thing. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. Um, but you have to wonder because other countries, they don't have this sort of. Um, I mean, Paul. I keep going back to Paul because he's sort of like my first reference point on the South, right? Before that, I haven't really had friends who have sort of gushed about the South. Jay Burden has talked to me a little bit about it, but not a whole lot. You say something about the South, and Paul just kind of like goes off. He gives you a dissertation that everyone enjoys. But he kind of talks about he's like, my goal is the era of good feelings, America. But that kind of America is like pre-Civil War. And you could argue that this kind of America carried on up until the early 1900s. It was an America that wasn't entirely ruled by free enterprise. Um, and you have to wonder, each decade that passed through the 20th century, America had a less and less and less identifiable culture. Um, the culture was in being victorious. The culture was in being the best, but there's an identity that gets lost. Um, it seems to me, and I've mentioned this multiple times, that if we didn't have to become the new hegemon, if the British Empire didn't fumble things, if we didn't have to step in their stead to sort of dictate to the world, we would have had a culture solidify even further. Because there was something that, and it had its own sort of face in each respective part of the country that was a distinct, very beautiful Americana. You could see the remnants of this in California. You could see it in Texas. You could see it in the Midwest, in Illinois, and Wisconsin, in the Northeast, in a South that was licking its wounds. There was somewhat of a through line. America used to be more of a nation of, humility and more, and not to get down the whole traditionalism bit, but money wasn't everything. The merchant class wasn't the main stage, even though we were outperforming the entire world at that point by the time the Gilded Age rolled around. You have to wonder if a policy of isolationism is the only way that we could create something authentic again. Because it seems to me we're running pretty thin, and I don't really know where else the idea of America could go until it sort of dies within its confines.
Yeah, I mean, I think I go back and forth on it all the time, but I always kind of go back to, in my opinion, I think in order for anything like that to occur, you'd almost have to have a complete, you'd have to have a complete shutdown of sort of attempts at globalization, and you'd have
Mhm.
to have some sort of isolation, but you'd also have to have a cutoff of like no more newcomers in coming in so that you can actually have a new culture be born out of it, right? Because like you look at it's sort of inevitable. Like if you were to cut things off now and just isolate the U.S., you're probably going to have a, the culture that would rise out of that, in my opinion, would be completely different than the old America because of the amount of like Hispanic immigrants you've had come in here, right? And if you look at like
Yeah.
rates of intermarriage, right? Not that interracial marriage is very common, but where it is the most common is Hispanic and white, right?
Hmm.
So you would easily see a new culture rise out of that, I would say. So, but you'd have to isolate it long enough for it to actually grow. I kind of think it's almost like it has to be nurtured, and it can't be nurtured if you're constantly throwing new stuff in there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the actual numbers are. I know, like, not to get sort of the political side of things, but I was actually seeing Trump's platform. Like this time around, he actually has more of a platform, which I was kind of
Hmm.
surprised. Last time, I think the goal of the Trump presidency was to just rupture the regime, and I think he actually did that. I'm being honest. I know we come from a very pessimistic side of the internet. We come from a side of the internet where we don't accept any victory as an actual victory. We always think there's a boogeyman around the corner coming to get us, because typically there is, to be fair.
Right.
Right. But looking back, Zero HP Lovecraft did a great piece called "The Spirit of 16." How it's like the opposite of the Spirit of 68, where the Spirit of 68 was like this feel good, like, oh man, you had to be there. We were all one. We accepted everyone. We finally, rose above and stuck it to the man. And like, you couldn't say anything to those people for decades, right? Being right
Oh
wing
yeah.
was illegal. Like Reagan is a leftist. Like Reagan's a leftist who just didn't want to be the latest extreme of leftism. He's a New Deal Democrat, and the New Deal is what ultimately, I mean, the FDR presidency is what really set things in motion to destroy the country, except maybe. I know the whole Wilson thing is contested by a lot of people with the Federal Reserve. Some people argue Andrew Jackson. Some people argue, Woodrow Wilson was the end of financial autonomy for the United States. But definitely the deep state America we know now stems from FDR. And beyond that, you kind of see the demographics at play, where the Trump presidency, the Trump platform is less about the Spirit of 16, where you're sort of finally, something's got to give. Like, no, we are going to tell people to leave. We are going to set boundaries. We are going to define what is and what is not American, what is and what is not okay. And that's kind of like initially like a bad spirit. Like it's a feeling bad spirit, but down the line it would be something good. Whereas the Spirit of 68 is like this vice. Like, no, I want to feel like we're including everyone, not really thinking about the intended consequences down the line of that. So they're flipped. And so that the left doesn't have the same shaming power that it once did. Right. I think the last hurrah was 2020, but after that, I don't foresee them having any leg to stand on in the future at all. So you have to wonder, without this lack of soft power and diminishing competency and hard power, I think when we look back, he kind of was successful in terms of rupturing that, but he didn't have much of a platform. This time around, there's a platform that has to do with, using the military to clean up cities, using the military to round up illegals and deport them, getting rid of rule of birth and reinstating the rule of blood. Like, that is a drastic change of things. And I know T7, he kind of talks about, Chicago's like ground zero for European immigration. With the way that the Supreme Court has been trending, it's not out of the realm of possibilities that the kind of immigration policy that we've seen from the 1960s could be overturned. So if we were to look at things now, like you said, I think a lot of people who are pining for the old Americana, I think the old Americana might just be dead.
Yeah, no, I think the closest thing you can get to like kind of what you're talking about is if you look at that original America First movement like around FDR's time, right?
Like Huey Long,
Huey Long, Father Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh, because even though, like, again, Father Coughlin's a Catholic priest, Lindbergh is, of German stock, right? They're not necessarily from the original Anglos that come here, but they had become, they were Americanized enough that they were pushing for an America First policy, right? And I think that if somehow, maybe it would be good for us on the DR to spend more time looking at those guys and what they were saying, because that might give somewhat of a map of like a path to follow, and also look at where they failed and where they succeeded.
Yeah. I don't know. It's funny. I kind of like a fascination with FDR, because when you actually like stop and look at him, like, it's almost for me becomes somewhat of an obsession. Like Tony Blair is to AA. It's like, wow, you were so incredible as a statesman, as a politician, as a leader of men, as a transformer of a nation for the wrong side. Like, imagine if you were for the right side. The competency is through the roof. But I don't really know much about that original American First movement, so that's something I'd be interested in studying with the 5 minutes of spare time that I have. But that's interesting, though, that, I mean, this kind of beckons back to the old stock Anglo, like, freaking out about the rise of Germans, when if you actually see, both the German Empire's ambitions and German peoples within the United States, they had very, like, humble, like, no, we just kind of want to do our own thing, like
Yeah.
ambitions. Like we actually do want to preserve America. The German Empire, for the most part, from what I can tell, I'm sure some person who's read, 16 more books about Otto von Bismarck and his hidden ambitions and the like can correct me. But from what I've read thus far, it seems to me that the German Empire didn't really have too much of an interest in supplanting the British Empire as the mistress of the seas, basically. They really were just fixated on the continent itself. Um, and with some some overseas possessions in Africa the like. But um, those people, what you're saying, like, no, we see what the Anglos have built. They're at the end of the day, the European peoples on the other side of the world, like we are. We want to preserve that culture. I think there is still a contingent within this nation that would want to preserve some last semblance. The fact that this nation was created to be a Europe elsewhere at the end of the day, with different ambitions, a bit more decentralized. There's a bit more rugged individualism at play. There's a bit more sovereignty at play, a little less top down, but we're at a point where top down seems to be the only choice at being able to do anything. We can't really afford to be the small government wing anymore if we want things to change. Um, I think would be fascinating though. Like, let's say, we did kind of overturn the immigration policy, and let's say that Hispanic contingent did interact with the white contingent. You kind of just see down the line an increasingly European bloodline because the Hispanic race is a mixture predominantly of Native American below the Rio Grande and European blood. So it'd be interesting to see, like, we could see resurgence almost of Spanish culture sort of accidentally, which is kind of a
Well,
weird thought to
the,
conjure.
well, yeah. I mean, because if you and it's been a while since I looked at the numbers, but I think when you do look at those, I guess you call them, if you want to call them intercultural, interracial marriages, usually when they occur, it's the Hispanics that have more Spanish ancestry marry.
Yeah,
Why it's not you're not getting the ones that are like basically Mayans, right?
right.
That's not who's marrying in. It's the ones that are passable as white almost or very close, right? I always tell people it's like when you see Mexicans on TV from like Telemundo versus what you see crossing the border. It's a big
Yeah,
difference.
big time, big time. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that would because I as much as and I know I get some crap for this because I'm not like the stand up like white nationalist guy, but I think there's going to be like because they're like oh just because I'm not 100% like mad that somebody marries outside of their ethnic group, but I think that you almost if you want something new, you're going to have an ethnogenesis, right? And that ethnogenesis is probably the most likely avenue would be some type of Hispanic, South American Hispanic culture mixed with this Anglo, or you almost kind of have to say that America is almost Anglo-Germanic to a degree because of the amount of German immigrants and how well they assimilated. Because people always forget how well German immigrants assimilated into America.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
I mean, they're both like Germanic Europeans, right?
well,
I
yeah,
mean,
your
not to get
cousins.
into Mustache Man, but Mustache Man wasn't really trying to throw hands with the UK. It was like, what are you talking about? We're basically the same.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would be kind of and if you see the sort of ambitions of project, I mean, I have a lot of family in Argentina. Like that's 97% white. Like
Right.
it's basically a slice of Spain down there. Well, really, it's a slice of Spain, Italy, and Germany down there, and we know where the Germans came from. Um, but yeah, there's a running joke like, "Oh, you want to speak Italian? Just speak Spanish with an Argentine accent." And there's some there's some truth to that. You could, but if you actually see, my wife is a big is a big architecture aficionado. She almost went to architecture school before she realized she didn't want to actually live the very hard life of an architect. If anyone has looked into it, she's still being in Europe right now. She's like very much loving walkable cities, and honestly, I love driving. But being a city boy from San Francisco, I take the BART every day. I do like walkable cities with good trams and whatnot. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be antithetical with the automobile. But do you see the projects that are sort of being done throughout Central America they're sort of pining for like a Greco-Roman ideal of living, which is interesting. So you're getting the people that you're going to get. This is elite theory 101. Like the people that you're going to get rise from that ethnogenesis is probably going to be more Eurocentric than people realize. It's not necessarily. And if there's when we get a real president again, um, if we ever get one, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be so optimistic, but if we ever got a real president again, like the amount of top-down policy, it's not going to be like this lawless third world that I think a lot of people on our side of the internet think are just the black pill movement just really thinks like it's just so over. Like no, we're just going to be West Africa or South Africa or Somalia, but I think that would be an interesting mixture because I guess in some ways California is originally like a Latin/Spanish mixture with Anglo culture, and it turned out pretty interesting architecturally and culturally. Same thing with Texas.
Well, yeah, I mean, even when you watch like the Robert Rodriguez films, like the mariachi and all, like in my opinion, when people see that and that's the sort of archetype of like that's Mexico, like that's way more European than the Mexico that you run into across the border, right? So it's already, and then people forget the German influence in Mexico. That's where their beer comes from. Their music is influenced by, to some degree, some of that German influence that came in. Because I was on the Fading Giant podcast a while back, and we were talking about how the last king of Mexico, I believe, or whatever. He was a Habsburg, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before he was overthrown. So like that culture is a lot more already, at least in that sphere, is a lot more European centric than people realize it is. And I've even said before, like if I had to go anywhere in the world, if I had to leave the U.S., Argentina or like Uruguay or Paraguay would be where I would go.
Yeah, that kind of seems to be a move. I have loads of family in Buenos Aires. And while I have my reservations about this new guy, he seems to be doing the right things, at least at first. We'll see a year from now. I'm not. That is one thing I'm certainly not optimistic about. So I've seen that movie before. But yeah, I don't think it'll be sort of as bad people thought. But if things did go south, right, you have to wonder. Actually, you did which I appreciate. You quoted my latest bad memories, talking about the Nietzschean way and the Christian way are sort of the only choices that America has now. That sort of Nietzschean spirit, that Faustian spirit, that's present in Noir, like, do you think that could disappear? Like, do you think that we could actually see like a rise from darkness? I know you're Catholic. I'm Orthodox. One of our saints, Saint Paisios, he has a quote saying, and Saint John of Kronstadt talks about that as well. It kind of falls in line with the cyclical historians because Christianity is not as linear as some people
Yeah.
might like to claim. We have an idea of an eighth day for a reason, but that no place is sort of abandoned for more than 3 generations, and it kind of seems like we're due for that. Do you think that sort of that spirit of noir that sort of shrouds the South and much of America could kind of vanish for a bit, or do you think the darkness at the edge of town will always find somewhere to hide?
I think I haven't really thought much of it in those terms, because one of the reasons that which I didn't mention this earlier. One of the reasons that I kind of was drawn to writing noir is because I do feel like it's one of the few mediums where you can really tell Christian stories that aren't corny. Like if you've ever seen any of those like Protestant films, like Facing Giants and stuff, they're very, you just pray really hard and everything is better, right? And that's and I grew up I grew up Southern Baptist tradition. That's kind of the way a lot of it is, right? Not all of it, but there's very much just once saved always saved, just go about your day, prosperity gospel infused sort of attitude. But I think what I guess my point is, like with noir, because the themes are so dark, you have the ability to tell these redemption stories, which is very Christian, obviously.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that from both from the I think there's you have the more the apophatic, the mystical tradition within Orthodoxy,
Hmm.
but you still have within Catholicism, especially from a more traditional bend, you still have that very Catholic guilt, original sin. I'm never actually going to be able to achieve salvation, but I'm going to try. And I
Hmm.
think Noir gives you the ability to tell real Christian stories about redemption, about flawed characters, um, that might actually speak to especially younger guys in our generation who, you know, they're not, you're not going to sell them on Christianity by selling them the happy-go-lucky stuff, especially because when the other alternative is will to power, Nietzschean vitality, right? Like, what are you
Yeah.
going to choose, right? But I've for years I've thought about like how do you infuse, and anybody who's kind of in our circles has probably thought at some point about like, can you infuse like Nietzschean Christianity, right? Is that possible? And you can argue that maybe the Crusaders or something like that, right? But I think I think it's always going to be somewhere. I think with the even within the darkness, you have so much potential to draw people to Christ through that darkness. If that makes sense.
No, that may, I mean, you're kind of preaching to the choir in a sense. Um, Two things I definitely want to respond to. But the first, I'll respond to the latter actually. BAP went on AA and towards the end of 2022, and he was like, "Yes, Mr. Agent," his forced comedic Russian accent. He actually said, which surprised me. He said, "I don't think that vitalism and Christianity are opposites. I think you can have a Christian moral framework and have a vitalist approach to the faith." And I spoke about this Jay Burden. In some ways, I kind of agree with that because um, there was a time in my life where I had come to Orthodoxy and I was working in bars. I quit my Silicon Valley job because I wanted to pursue professional fighting. My ambitions were to be a professional fighter and then be a monk at Valon Monastery up in Karelia. Um, and I had these sets of circumstances where it's like, well, if I don't train, I'm going to get knocked out, right?
Yeah,
So there's vitality there. If I don't, I had 7 shifts a week. I live in the Bay Area. It's expensive. If I don't work, I'm going to starve. And if I
yeah.
don't pray, I might end up somewhere less than favorable. In respect to your view on Noir, one of the reasons I want to talk to you was just that. There's a book that I'm writing that is actually autobiographical, um, called Sleepless, and I've released chapters behind a paywall on Substack, but I'm just going to make it public. Um, and it's a time in my life from January of 2020 to January of 2022 where I kind of went through this prodigal son story where I was in the Bay Area, COVID hit. I wasn't of the faith then. I refused to take unemployment. I went from making 6 figures behind the bar and having the perfect schedule to be a fighter to being below the poverty line despite working overnight security, 2 hours of a commute each way. And that's actually what brought me back to God. And I was interacting in bars and with crime and decay and the Black Lives Matter riots, um, and I one day, actually after I got baptized in the Orthodox Church in the summer of 2022, like 2 days later, I just sort of bled out a chapter and I sent it to writer friends of mine. I'm like, hey, I think I have about 600 pages of this. Is this worth writing? And he's like, yeah, I think so. I was like, okay, cool. And the first couple of chapters were before COVID hit, and it's a lot of neon. I'm in and out of like these weird bars in Oakland and Berkeley and these little sea towns that are adjacent to these places. And a good friend of mine who writes in the moniker Prismatic Orthodox, is an Orthodox account, really interesting writer on Instagram. He's like, he actually once told me our faith is always on offense, not necessarily physically, but spiritually. We're supposed to overtake everything, absolutely everything. And his view was that noir is a mechanism that can really be Christianized to tell compelling stories of joyful sorrow, where we have this sorrow. But when we fully understand the weight of our sins, the opposite of this "I'm saved, let's go to Buffalo Wild Wings" mentality, you see that always drove me nuts when I was a Protestant. Um, and it's the opposite of that, where it's like, okay, well, I now understand the weight of my sin, and actually, I will forever be trying to understand the weight of my sin. And I'll forever be trying to repent, and I'll have this joy and this sorrow because now that I know that I'm accepting this, I can actually repent from it. I can actually work towards salvation in the sacraments, in confession, in communion. Um, the only story that actually comes to mind with that is Daredevil, if you're familiar.
Yeah, yeah. That was like that was my favorite comic growing up, actually.
Oh, see, I actually haven't read any of the comics, but I watched the series like a good 6 times. Because something about that. It was like Batman, but with less money and maybe a little more real world problems, honestly. Um, but yeah, it's I think what you're doing is pretty noble, and I really would like to see it all flesh out. I'm excited to see where the story goes. Where could people find you, John?
You can find me at Twitter on T Propensity. My Substack is Texas John Slaughter at Substack.com. You can find me there. Um, Give me a, I love feedback. So if you read my work and you have suggestions or anything like that, I'd be more than glad to hear them, because once I put this whole thing together, it'll probably be dramatically different from the sort of the draft chapters I am putting out there. So.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that. I'm like, I'm sure Sleepless will probably be like 800 pages, and then when I want to release an actual physical thing, I'm gonna have to greatly cut it down because some of it will seem sort of redundant. So it's an interesting. It's like a live version of Right Drunk Edit Sober. We're all seeing you right. They're seeing us right drunk on Substack, and then we're presenting them the sober buttoned up version when it goes to print. Um, yeah, everyone give John Slaughter a follow on Substack. He's one of my favorite reads now. Follow him on Twitter. Follow all the DR bros. Paul Fahrenheit, Jay Burden, Full Sturker, Intrepid Tactics, the like. And as always, everyone, good night, good storms. God bless. Thank you.